Okay.
It's past now. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the China Seminar Series at the Australian Center on China and the World. My name is Wang Xian. I am a postdoctoral fellow at the center and the seminar moderator. Before we begin, we wish to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respect to the elders, past and present. Today, our special speaker is Mr. Robert L. Suettinger. He is a historian of contemporary politics in the People's Republic of China. His most recent book, this one, The Conscience of the Party, Yaobang, China's Communist Reformer, was published in October 2024 by Harvard University Press. A former intelligence officer, he retired in 1998 and subsequently worked for several think tanks and consulting companies, including the Brookings Institution, RAND, Centra Technology, and the Stimson Center. In his US government career, Suettinger spent 24 years with the Central Intelligence Agency. He also worked in State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, the National Intelligence Council, and the National Security Council, where he assisted National Security Advisors Anthony Lake and Samuel R. Berger in the development of American policy towards East Asia. Suettinger holds an MA from Columbia University and a BA from Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin. He served in the US Army in the then Republic of Vietnam between 1969 and 1970. Today, his talk is titled What Hu Yaobang's Rise and Fall Means for Understanding Xi Jinping. Following his presentation, we will have some time for Q&A. Now, please join us in welcoming Mr. Suettinger. Around 45 minutes.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I haven't been in Canberra for a long time, and it's interesting to see how it hasn't changed and how it continues to flourish. It's a lovely city, and I'm happy to be here. I want to talk a little bit. I want to tell you a couple stories actually, and see if we can. If you have a burning question, please don't feel afraid to interrupt me and ask it, because I sometimes have too much to say and I want to give you a chance to ask some questions. I started this book a long time ago. I was the branch chief at the Central Intelligence Agency on domestic affairs in the People's Republic of China. And Hu Yaobang was the General Secretary during the time that I was there. So I wrote or supervised the writing of several papers about him, including his purge, which we sort of got wrong. He was an interesting figure because he was not your typical leader. He was about that tall, and he weighed less than 100 pounds and for much of his life. So he wasn't one of these people that sort of towers over you and has a commanding presence. But he had a commanding intellect, and that intellect was developed from his earliest days in Hunan province. He was a poor peasant from a poor peasant Hakka family in eastern Hunan province. His father was a coal carrier and part-time farmer. He was in the Hakka tradition. He was educated by members of his clan, and he turned out to be a very precocious student. So they took him to a school in Wenjia, and then ultimately he was schooled for a very brief period of time in a Western style middle school in come on, Bob. It's gonna be one of those days. In a county town. It'll come to me in the middle of the next sentence. But at any rate, because it was in the mid-20s, the warlords were going back and forth between Changsha and Guangzhou, and it was a time when the anti-communists and KMT battles were going on fiercely, including the execution of a lot of his teachers. So Yaobang eventually decided that he couldn't continue his education, and he went up Jigangshan at the age of 15 and joined the revolutionaries, Mao Zedong, Zhuge, and was there long enough to be threatened with execution by people that were loyal to Mao. He then went on a long march, which he barely survived, was educated again at Yan'an, and became an acolyte of Chairman Mao. Because they spoke the same dialect of Hunanese. Mao liked him because he was an avid student and a good listener. Hello, John, good to see you. And he got involved in both the educational aspects of the school, and he was actually worked for the Central Social Department, which wasn't something that the family wanted everybody to know. I had to sort of dig that out of some of my archival research. But he worked for Kang Cheng for a brief period of time. They didn't get along very well, and Kang Cheng eventually arrested his wife. But Yaobang then went on to the North China Field Army during the Civil War, fought in the Battle of Taiyuan, which was probably the bloodiest battle that was fought in the Civil War. 43,000 Communist Party soldiers were killed in that battle, countless numbers of civilians in the city of Taiyuan. And then he went on down to Sichuan province, where he became the administrator of 1/4 of Sichuan province, and he worked for Deng Xiaoping. The primary purpose of that administration was to get rid of all the KMT and warlords and other KMT and soldiers who were left over from the Civil War. And they probably eliminated somewhere around 800,000 people in that area. So he was, and then of course they went on to the land reform campaigns, 3 anti, 5 anti. And essentially this was the continuation of the Civil War without an opposition. Because they just rounded up people and executed them. It was a very sobering experience for him, but eventually it got him a position in the Youth League, in the Communist Youth League in 1952. He was appointed by Mao. He was an avid loyalist of Chairman Mao, and everything that Chairman Mao did in that early phase, Yaobang made sure that it was taught to all of the students and young people that were in the Communist Youth League, which grew under his tenure from 6 million members to 20 million in about 5 years. So he was a very effective organizer. He got these young people very much involved in learning about what communism was all about and what Chairman Mao's thinking was all about. He progressed to the Central Committee very early, and then he began a process of let's call it disappointment in what the Communist Party was doing, and it was a gradual affair. I mean, he started out. He did an investigation of some youth league areas during the Great Leap Forward, which, as probably most of you know, was a great leap backward, and certainly for the people of China, for the peasants of China in particular, it was a great leap into oblivion. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 36 million is one of the lower figures of the potential number of people who were killed, either by starvation or being beaten to death or executed or otherwise becoming ill because they weren't getting any food. It was a miserable time, and he was sort of forced because he hadn't, when Mao purged Peng Dehuai in 1959, Yaobang was an old colleague of Peng Dehuai. He fought with Peng in the Battle of Taiyuan. And so he was relatively reluctant to criticize it. And during the meeting at Dushan in 1959, Yaobang was sort of quiet. He raised his hand at the right time, but he didn't say anything. And Chairman Mao noticed, and basically, as who put it, put him on the back chair, on the cold chair. So he had to kind of fight his way back into good graces. And he did this in 2 places. One was Shantung province, or Shantung prefecture in Hunan province, his home province. And the other one was in Shanxi province, where he was the first secretary of the Shanxi committee. In both places, he was not sufficiently ardent in his faith in Chairman Mao, and he was withdrawn from both places, first to the Youth League, but actually both times to the Youth League, But the second time he was sort of in disgrace and was rescued by his old Hakka friend from Guangzhou, General Xi. So he was a popular fellow within the party. He was animated. He had a good sense of humor. He was an effective organizer. He was a good motivator. And he came back to Beijing in 1965. And in 1966, the Cultural Revolution started before he had actually gotten another job. But he was affiliated with the Youth League, and the Youth League was, of course, the first victim of the Cultural Revolution in 1966 because they made the mistake of obeying Liu Shaoqi's orders that they should help quell the Red Guard movement in the primary and elementary schools. So Yaobang was one of the first to be dragged out and beaten and punished by the Red Guards in 1966. He sort of had a yo-yo career. Chairman Mao brought him back for the 12th plenum of the 8th Central Committee, where he voted for Liu Shaoqi to be permanently expelled from the party. But that didn't do him any good because he didn't make the 9th Central Committee, and he was sent to a labor camp in Henan province for about 3 years. All of that, and it was one of the worst of the 571 schools, in the sense that there was no housing, there was no medical facilities, there wasn't really very much food, and it was a miserable place for anybody to be in. He was not allowed to be recognized as even a member of the party. But eventually, after Lin Biao died, Hu Yaobang was allowed to come home. So he went back to his place in Beijing, in Zhongnanhai, outside Zhongnanhai, but they had no job for him. Chairman Mao didn't want to come back, so he sat in his room smoking cigarettes. He was a 5-pack-a-day man, and reading books and thinking about what happened to him. Eventually, Ye Jianying promoted him with Hua Guofeng to be head of, or the third secretary of the party school, where he was assigned. First of all, he was said, you got to get the classes going again, which meant getting the PLA out of all the dormitories and the housing. And secondly, putting together a curriculum. And Hu Yaobang showed his reformist colors very subtly in that period. He basically started asking the people, why did we have a cultural revolution, and why did it last for 10 years? And he knew the answer to that question. The answer to that question was Chairman Mao, but nobody could say that because at that point, Chairman Mao had just died, and there was still a great reverence for him, and Hu Yaobang understood that reverence because he had practiced it. But I think probably in his heart of hearts, and I don't know this because I don't read minds, he probably was pretty disenchanted with Chairman Mao and the damage that had been done to the party. So subsequently, his career rose very, very rapidly. He was head of the organization department, during which time he brought back from disgrace something in the neighborhood of 550,000 cadre, most of whom had been purged under the auspices of Deng Xiaoping's control over the anti-rightist campaign beginning in 1957. Many of them had also fallen during the Cultural Revolution. And he instituted processes by which all those people could be brought back, and many of the people who weren't cadres, who were just criticized as intellectuals, as rightists, as counter-revolutionaries, he enabled them to be brought back, to be given their jobs back in many cases, and their families were given back their political rights. So a lot of people were beholden to Hu Yaobang for that. And that eventually got him into the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee, and during which he provided a lot of the material that China Yun used to hijack that meeting. It was the work conference before the 11th plenum that was really where everything took place and was started and finished. It wasn't, the 11th plenum was like most party plenums, well planned in advance. But Deng flipped the script on Hua Guofeng and used it to promote reform. Deng Xiaoping, in fact, at that point, allowed himself to be called the architect of reform, even though he didn't really know what reform was all about. As far as he was concerned, China's economy was a bit of a wreck, and it needed to be fixed. And he basically said anything that we can do to get the economy up and running again is fine. Hu Yaobang had a slightly different idea about what reform constituted. And he didn't speak up during that. He went along, provided all the materials that were needed for a lot of rehabilitations, including Chen Yun, at that plenum. But he also began to be active in propaganda affairs. And as a result of that plenum, he was brought back onto the Central Committee. He was given a position on the Politburo and was put in charge of the propaganda department. So using that bully pulpit, which is really what the propaganda department is, Yaobang held a meeting, and it was called a meeting on propaganda work affairs, and it was held in 1979, and he allowed to be invited to that a lot of old intellectuals and a lot of party intellectuals. And it was, we still don't have many of the speeches that were given at that meeting because they were incendiary. All these old intellectuals could not wait for their opportunity to lambaste Chairman Mao and to basically say, you want to know why we had a cultural revolution? That's the reason. And his crazy ideology and his ridiculous means of running the party are what gave us the enormously destructive cultural revolution. And Yaobang didn't go along with that. He just let people talk. But there was another Wu that was at that meeting, Wu Jiamu. And Wu Jiamu was Deng's particular, he was a biganzi, he was a scribe. And he wrote a lot of speeches and so forth, and he was absolutely appalled at the kinds of things that were being said at that meeting with Hu Yaobang's blessing. And he went back to Deng Xiaoping, who was just coming back from the United States at that point from his 1979 visit. And he said, you've got to stop this. And he laid out in chapter and verse the fact that Hu Yaobang was allowing the de-Maoization of the Communist Party of China. And Deng Xiaoping said, basically, we aren't going to have any of that, are we? So Deng Xiaoping gave his famous For Uphold speech on March 30th of 1979, which essentially was a return to ideological orthodoxy for the Communist Party, and he stuck to that for the rest of his time in power. And Hu Yaobang was not criticized, he was not fired, but he was certainly reduced in authority. And he kind of had to kind of crawl his way back up to recover his right stance with the party and with Deng. But the fact of the matter is that Deng had a bigger goal in mind, which was to get rid of Hua Guofeng. Hua Guofeng was appointed, of course, by Chairman Mao, and he was Deng's target. He was at that point, he was chairman of the party, chairman of the military commission, and premier of the state council. And even though he didn't really operate in any of those jobs very effectively, Deng Xiaoping wanted him out. And what they went through in order to accomplish that was what later became known as a party life meeting. It was something similar to a meeting that we're going to talk about in a couple minutes. And everybody sort of ganged up. The entire Politburo and the Secretariat was invited to this meeting, and they were all invited to criticize Hua Guofeng. Hua Guofeng had basically seen this coming, and he resigned his position even before the meetings began. But they had to go ahead with him anyway, and he was destroyed. He was removed from all of his positions, but allowed to stay on the Politburo Standing Committee. And in fact, they wanted him to remain as honorary chairman of the party to meet with foreigners. That was considered to be the most authority he could have and do the least damage, because Deng was running foreign policy and everybody knew it. But he refused, and he refused to make any public appearances, and was on the standing committee until the party plenum in 1981, when Hu Yaobang became briefly the chairman of the party. So here's a guy that in 1977 was a nobody, had no official positions, had just come out of a prison camp. And in 1979, and in 1981, by 1981, he was chairman of the party. In 1982, he became the General Secretary. They abolished the chairmanship. And Hu Yaobang was chosen. Why was he chosen? Well, Deng Xiaoping didn't want the job himself because he was elderly at that point, and he didn't want to take the fire that he knew was going to be coming to that position. And so he basically trusted Hu Yaobang, even though Hu had kind of disappointed him ideologically. But Deng made certain, and Chen Yun made certain, that Hu Yaobang knew that the two of them were in charge. and that he was just a front office guy and he should do what he was told. Hu Yaobang was not, even though he was chairman and then general secretary of the party, he could not call a meeting of the standing committee because Chen Yun and Deng Xiaoping didn't like to be in those meetings together because they didn't get along with each other. They had very different approaches to economic reform, very different approaches toward governance. And Hu Yaobang basically just had to stand back and either let them fight it out in private quarters or get along with whatever they could do. Hu Yaobang was very active in his role as general secretary and party chairman. The kinds of things that he was able to accomplish were one, a dissolution of the commune system, which had brought about the Great Leap Forward economic disasters, and two, he began to reform policy toward minorities, and three, he approved of the institution of special economic zones in Shenzhen and elsewhere in Guangdong province. So he was known as a practitioner of reform. And he started those reforms before Deng Xiaoping did. Deng Xiaoping said, well, I don't disagree with dissolving the communes, but I'm not sure it's going to work. And as far as the special economic zones were concerned, Chen Yun was absolutely adamantly opposed, as was Li Xianyan. That fact is not well known, but they were, and they never approved of them. But Hu Yaobang pushed them along anyway, and you know, the progress was gradual, but it was clear that he was in favor of these kinds of reforms. Some of the other things that happened as a result of the reform movement in China was this opening and reform and opening, Kaifang. And part of the Kaifang was allowing foreign investment, foreign practices, foreign music, foreign styles, and a lot of the elders that Hu Yaobang had brought back when he was head of the organization department, looked on that with great distaste. And they criticized him. Hu Yaobang's nemesis was a guy named Deng Liqun. And Deng Liqun and Hu Qiaomu were a pair. And what a pair they were extreme leftists. They were against any kind of progress. They were certainly against any kind of moderation of Mao Zedong thought. And they were really very much opposed to allowing Western influence to come into China in any kind of formidable way. So they put Hu Yaobang on his back feet often because Deng Xiaoping relied on both of them for drafting his speeches. So Hu Yaobang was often criticized. He had his own idea about what reform was. Reform for Hu Yaobang was not an economic policy. It was not a set of ideals. It was an attitude. And the attitude comes from the word gai. Gai means to change. And you have to change because you've done something wrong. You've made a mistake. And whose attitude was, if you've made a mistake, recognize that you've made a mistake, fix it. Don't stick to that policy if it isn't working. And don't criticize the people that called it to your attention. And finally, and most importantly, don't use Mao Zedong thought, don't use ideology in general as a stick with which to beat your political enemies. So he had a very different kind of approach to what reform is all about. And he wasn't able to make that public and wasn't able to do it in any kind of a way because he knew that neither Chen Yun nor Deng Xiaoping would really approve of it if he did. In fact, when he made a speech about it in 1983, Chen Yun called him on the carpet and basically Deng Liqun and Hu Qiaomu wanted to basically have a central committee meeting in which they would withdraw his positions. He basically fired him. Deng Xiaoping said, no, we're not going to do that. By that time, he had brought Zhao Ziyang onto the Politburo Standing Committee as well. And Zhao was beginning to operate very effectively as premier of the State Council. So the two men, although they didn't have a lot to do with each other, got along reasonably well. And when they needed to combat the spiritual pollution movement in 1984, which you may remember, it was, calling people on the carpet for wearing bell-bottom pants, cutting their hair, or letting their hair grow long, and so forth. It was against all cultural manifestations of Western influence. But they managed to get that kind of shoved back into the closet. But it didn't stay there for long. But Hu Yaobang was nothing if not smart and nothing if not clever in how to get around some of his obstacles. So by 1985, Hu Yaobang had kind of restored his authority. But then unfortunately for him, Ye Jianying died. And Ye Jianying had been his backer even though he was quite ill. And in 1986, Ye Jianying died, and within a matter of a couple of weeks of Ye Jianying's funeral, Chen Yun, Deng Xiaoping, Li Xianyan gathered together at a private meeting, which we don't have any memos about, but there's been a lot of speculation, that Hu Yaobang was an impediment to their rule. Hu Yaobang was calling for all three of them to retire, which they said they wanted to do, but they didn't really want to do that. They were having too much fun as being the backstage organizers and ordainers of policy, and allowing Zhao Ziyang and Hu Yaobang to sort of implement them in their stead. It was sort of power without responsibility, and Hu Yaobang and Zhao had responsibility without power. So it was as a number of historians of that era have pointed out, it was not a workable approach. And when things began to get a little dicey in 1986, by some student demonstrations that were taking place, criticizing the failure of reform policies to be implemented, Hu Yaobang was given the blame for it. He submitted his resignation to Deng because Deng had said, stop those demonstrations with force. If one person shows up to protest, arrest one person. If 1,000 people show up to protest, arrest 1,000. And they were expecting those demonstrations to take place on January 1st, 1986. They did show up, but Hu Yaobang had organized, one of his last orders was to organize the Ministry of State Security to surround the Martyrs Monument with kids, with youth league kids. And it was a cold day and nobody wanted to protest anyway. So the protest never amounted to much, but Hu Yaobang was done. And they had a party life meeting for him in mid-January. He was emotionally destroyed by it. And the party passed the meeting passed a resolution pending approval by the 6th plenum, and later in 1981 that Hu Yaobang was going to step aside as chairman of the Central Committee and would remain on the Politburo Standing Committee, but would have no authority and no job. So he was done, and he wept bitterly because Zhao Ziyang was the last one to turn on him, and Zhao Ziyang was not kind. He said, I'm happy to approve of this. And he had said this before to Chen Yun and Deng Xiaoping, you guys need to fix this problem. Hu Yaobang cannot be trusted. And if he gets power, I won't be able to work with him. And he basically said that at this meeting. And it was the coup de grace for Hu Yaobang. He didn't know it beforehand. He probably didn't really trust Zhao Ziyang. But that was the end for him. He then spent the next 2 years, not quite, about 2 years, feeling sorry for himself, wandering around the countryside and going to visit places because he still had the right to do that. But he visited Tianjin and Li Ruihuan and said, you don't need to make visits, you shouldn't make them. Nobody's listening to you and you can't have any influence on policy. So go back and work on your calligraphy, write some poems, and stay out of sight, which is essentially what he did. And in 1989, he came back for a Politburo meeting on education because he thought education was important. And he had a stroke or a heart attack at the Politburo meeting. They got him to the hospital where he survived for about a week, and then he died on April 15th, 1989. On the 22nd was his funeral. And by the time his funeral was held, there were several 100,000 people in Tiananmen Square mourning his loss, raising signs, criticizing the party. The wrong guy died, was what was said. And one of the posters that was most memorable was Hu Yaobang, the soul of the conscience of the party and the soul of the nation. People were sorry that they hadn't stood up for him in 1987. They had seen the kind of reforms that took place in the 2 years that followed his resignation, and they weren't working. And there was economic chaos in many places. They had to run on the banks in 1988. The university structure was not operating correctly. The students were angry. Everybody was demanding democracy. And Deng Xiaoping was terrified of this large mass of people protesting against the governing party of the People's Republic of China. And after the funeral ceremony, which was just a notch or two below the protocol for his job, and didn't recognize him for all the things that he did, but the crowds were such that the funeral cortege that went to Babaoshan, where his body was cremated, basically forced that cortege to take an hour to get to travel 20 minutes to get from People's Hall, the Great Hall of People, to Babaoshan, because everybody was out there wanting to pay their respects. So Hu Yaobang's name disappeared from the media for the next 16 years. He was a persona non grata, he was a non-person. Until the protege that Hu Yaobang was most happy he saved, a fellow named Hu Jintao, was brought in to replace Jiang Zemin. They instituted a system called skip generation succession. The succession was not working. Mao Zedong had purged a couple of his chosen successors. Deng Xiaoping purged a couple of his, and the successor that was chosen in 1989, Jiang Zemin, was not Deng's choice. It was Chen Yun and Li Xiannian's choice, because he came out of Shanghai. They knew him because they all went down there for their rest periods. And Deng Xiaoping had to allow that to happen, because people don't know this, but he was not given a lot of credit. He was given a lot of blame for what happened on June 4th. He called in the military, and what happened was not probably what he really wanted, but he was not afraid of causing bloodshed. And he essentially told people, don't fear bloodshed. These people have to be brought into line. So his was the order. He mandated the use of force, and it turned out to be a disaster. Li Xiannian and Chen Yun sort of never forgave him for it. And they said, you're not getting to name the next successor, we are. And Deng came back and said, well, I'll name the next one. And the one that he named was Hu Yaobang's, not his direct protege, because that was another Hu named Hu Qi. But he chose his successor out of the Communist Youth League because they were good. They knew how to administer things. They were honest, and they weren't ideologically tied to Chairman Mao's thought. So Hu Jintao made the decision that since Hu Yaobang was not directly involved in the Tiananmen incident or the crushing of the Tiananmen incident, it was okay to allow him to be publicized in the press again. And so in 2005, he was given an official rehabilitation ceremony. It wasn't quite a full rehabilitation because they didn't admit that they fired him in 1987, and they didn't call him a great Marxist. So it was about 2 notches down from what he deserved. Protocol, by the way, and I'll come back to this, is extremely important within the party. Deng Xiaoping always had to give way to Chen Yun. Why? Not because Chen Yun was a great thinker. Why? Because Chen Yun was a member of the Politburo and its standing committee in the 1930s, whereas Deng didn't join until the 1950s. So he always was outranked by Chen Yun, and it is surprising, and the book covers this in some detail. Surprising the number of times that Deng Xiaoping, in order to trade personnel with Chen Yun, essentially had to give policy preferences to Chen Yun's backward-looking economic policies. Chen Yun was the head of the economic bureaucracy during the first 5-year plan, 1952 to 57. And it was straight Stalinist. Heavy industry, light on light on agricultural and light industry, everything planned. And Chen Yun actually instituted the program of quotas and requirements for production of agricultural produce. And if you didn't produce what you said you would produce, you had to meet your quotas first, and if you didn't have anything to eat afterward, that was your problem. So guess why 40 million people died during the Great Leap Forward? Because they collected those quotas from them and didn't allow them to keep any of them on their own. And if they did keep it on their own, they were accused of hoarding, and many people were executed summarily for hoarding during the Great Leap Forward. So Chen Yun has a big blood debt on his head, but nobody ever called him on it. But you know, it was known that Chen Yun was the person to whom Deng Xiaoping had to give way. And every time that he gave way to Chen Yun, economic policies slid backwards. They didn't do reform and opening. They did adjustment and de-reform. So there was this up and down movement of the economy that everybody noticed. And it wasn't until Deng Xiaoping went on his southern tour in 1992 when he essentially told Jiang Zemin, who was, as you may recall, Chen Yun's protege, and who was very much in favor of this backward approach to the economy. Deng basically confronted him and said, "You will reform or you will be out of a job." And Jiang Zemin saw the light and pushed reform, and Deng went on his tour of Shenzhen, and reform was up and running again. And basically it's all history from there on. Deng Xiaoping thereafter was less involved in the economy, and people who were like Jiang Zemin were enthusiastic about reform. They brought in a lot of money, they brought in a lot of influence from the West, and China began to flourish. So reform began to gain its own momentum under Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin. So what happened to Hu Jintao? Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping was the skip generation successor that was chosen for him by Jiang Zemin. Now that's not a well-known story, but it is fairly clear that the Shanghai Bang and the people from Shanghai who dominated the Politburo under Jiang Zemin decided that they didn't necessarily want to have another youth league person coming in to succeed Hu Jintao. So they brought in Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping, one of the first meetings he had as he was awaiting his coronation in 2012 was a meeting with Hu Yaobang's son, Hu Deping. And we don't know what that meeting actually, we haven't seen the meeting, the minutes, but the Hong Kong media reported that they talked about reform. And but it didn't work because Xi Jinping wasn't really interested in reform. Xi Jinping wanted what was kind of an ideologically conservative individual who thought that the Soviet Union had made fundamental errors when they did Glasnost and what are the other terms? Perestroika. Thank you. And so he systematically rolled back all of the reforms that Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin had instituted. So we are where we are today. So what significance does Hu Yaobang have to our understanding of Xi Jinping? Well, you have to understand that the political struggles, not only in terms of policy, but particularly in terms of personnel, because personnel is what constitutes power in the PRC and the Communist Party of China. You get power by putting your people in the important positions. The important positions really from the perspective of the party, and Diamond, my wife, has written about this extensively, is the military, the public security apparatus, the central apparatus of the Communist Party, the general office and the propaganda department, and the propaganda department is a power of its own. So anybody that is able to control those bureaucracies and those institutions has a leg up on everybody else. So Xi Jinping started off with propaganda. He worked his way into the military. He got his people into the general office and elsewhere, and became in the eyes of many of the people inside China, and especially people outside of China. He was the chairman of everything. He was large and in charge. And he was the chairman of the military commission. He was he was general secretary of the party. And he established all these these leading policy groups. And it looked like he had a lock on everything. And lo and behold, he was able to get himself appointed to a third term as general secretary, breaking the precedents that had been followed by previous people. Jiang Zemin didn't want to give up those jobs in 2002, and he wanted to keep them. And he held on to the chairman of the military commission because he knew perfectly well that that was the position that Deng had used to keep his eye on and his control on everything that was going on. But Xi Jinping and others didn't allow Hu Jintao to do that. And so he never really got his foot in the door for the power positions. And Xi Jinping was able to do it. So now we are where we are. And where are we? Well, we don't really know. Xi Jinping appears to be in trouble. And this is where things get a little dicey because the propaganda apparatus in the PRC is still very much under Xi Jinping's control. So everything that happens there, at least until the last couple of months, is relatively well smoothed out and controlled. One of the problems is, and this is a problem for people like myself who are used to analyzing the details of what's going on in Beijing, is that the details are coming out from non-official sources. There is a thing called the internet, and the internet has some things called YouTube and X.com and other places where people who are outside of China but who are ethnic Chinese can write in their own language about what they think is going on. Some of these individuals and organizations are affiliated with Falun Gong, and some of them have been opponents of the communist regime in the PRC for a long period of time. So you have to kind of take what they say with the proverbial grain of salt. And for many, particularly Western analysts, particularly American analysts of the People's Republic of China, who don't have sufficient familiarity with the kinds of language that is utilized on these websites, and who don't think that they're important in the first place, they ignore them. But since the middle of May, there has been a series of commentators and memes and ideas that have been floated about that said that Xi Jinping began to be in serious trouble back in July of 2024, when there was the third plenum of the party was held, and the elders who were instrumental in the downfall of both Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang, the elders who were in many cases, there's one of them who was 105, but most of them were in their 80s, and they all retired according to plan, and they were given respect. A couple of them were sort of shoved aside because they were really corrupt. But they were still in good order. Hu Jintao, for example, was still in good Wen Jiabao, and a number of these people were still respected. And when they were respected, it means they could come to Central Committee meetings, they could come to special meetings at Beidaihe, or they could come to expanded Politburo Standing Committee meetings, because they used to be on the Politburo Standing Committee. And in that capacity, they were not allowed to vote, but they were allowed to attend. Well, apparently at some kind of meeting that was held in Beidaihe, and we don't really know exactly who was there and who wasn't, Xi Jinping was roundly criticized. Why? Because everything that Xi Jinping has touched since 2012 has turned to crap. The Chinese economy has gone downhill. Social stability is now enforced by the most extensive and nasty surveillance system that the world has ever seen or known. The theory, the ideological situation in the PRC now, I dare and defy any of you to read Xi Jinping thought for more than 5 minutes without falling asleep. And any of you that can learn how to recite it, you're eligible to become a cadre in the Communist Party. It is absolutely deadly. But it is required reading for everybody, and everybody who is required to read it hates it. And they won't say that out loud, but they do. Xi Jinping's authority took a big hit during COVID. It took another big hit when the former premier and his counterpart in his first 2 terms as General Secretary, a man named Li Keqiang, who was out of the Youth League, surprisingly, and was Xi Jinping's bête noire. They didn't get along, they didn't like each other, and they essentially parted company. Li Keqiang, who was a bit of a health nut, who ate healthy meals and was protected by a battalion of doctors wherever he went because he had been an authoritative figure, went down to Shanghai and died in a swimming pool of a heart attack, and was brought back to Beijing. No autopsy was done of his body. He was cremated without any kind of an examination, and was given a funeral at Babaoshan that was about 2 levels below what he deserved as being premier. And again, these kind of details matter. His wife was furious about it. His family refused to even look at Xi Jinping, much less shake his hand, because nobody knew what had happened to Li Keqiang, but everybody suspected the same thing, which was that Xi Jinping had him bumped off. Who will rid me of this troublesome priest? So Li Keqiang became in his death not a martyr, but something that everybody remembered. So fast forward to today. According to these newspaper accounts, Xi Jinping was given what amounted to a party life meeting of the sort that Yaobang got and that Hua Guofeng got, which was that everybody got a chance without being interrupted or thrown into jail to say what they thought about what the job that Xi Jinping was doing, because everybody knew what a bad job he was doing. The economy was in the dumps. COVID-19 was killing people in large numbers and causing the economy to continue to fail. And Xi Jinping was just sort of, he was trying to do a personality cult. Xi Jinping is referred to as Baozi, and he looks a bit like a Duncan. He's kind of dovish, and people made fun of him. There was this wonderful photograph of a bag of dumplings hanging from a dead tree, that showed up for about 40 seconds on the Chinese website, and everybody looked at it and laughed, and then of course it was erased. But Xi Jinping was held in low esteem everywhere, and everybody knew it. Taxi drivers knew it, academics knew it. So he was called to account at the meeting in July, and was basically given a year to fix things. And they said, otherwise we're gonna remove you from your authority. And his response was, I'm not going, and who are you gonna replace me with? So he brought in, he strengthened his thug group, and had what he thought was control of the apparatus in the Central Guards Unit, in the Beijing Garrison, the People's Armed Police, and armed forces in and around Beijing. Well, along comes a guy named Zhang Youxia, who not only was responsible for the movement, the removal of other members of the Central Military Commission, but was also responsible for the removal of a number of Xi Jinping's proteges who were in other parts of the apparatus. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Defense, and the Minister of Public Security, and a couple of other of these key security posts that he would require if he ever needed to defend his authority by military or police means. Again, in the PRC, those ministries and those authorities are damn important. Mao Zedong knew it, Deng Xiaoping knew it, Zhao Ziyang knew it, and they are the key to survival of a party that is much detested by its own people. So where we are at this point is we don't know. They had these meetings, and these accounts of the meetings are really quite remarkable. They are very detailed. They're not, we don't have the recordings or anything, but we've got what appear to be notes that give the principal points of the speeches that were given. And again, I have to stress this, we don't know how authoritative these are, and there's every reason to be skeptical of it. Because who have they brought? They've determined, according to these stories, who's going to replace Xi Jinping. And the people are coming to replace Xi Jinping are both from the youth league. A guy named Wang Yang, who was on the Politburo Standing Committee, very influential, very reformist, and a guy named Hu Chunhua. Hu Chunhua is also a youth league person. You may recall at the 22nd Congress of the Central Committee. Am I going over my time yet? Probably close.
No, we can still have,
Okay, I'm just about done.
You wouldn't want to omit this bit.
Huh?
You wouldn't want to omit this bit, so there's
No. I mean, simply because nobody has picked it up, I'm just kind of winging it on this, but the information is there. And if you ignore it, you may be ignoring a major change, or you may be ignoring what will be a huge fight for power in the PRC, because Xi Jinping, he has not made the kinds of public appearances that you would expect he would make. And I'll go into the detail on that later, but the fact of the matter is that Hu Chunhua was on the list that was approved by the Politburo Standing Committee before the 22nd Congress. He was going to become the premier. He was going to replace Li Keqiang. But Xi Jinping changed that list, and he didn't tell Hu Jintao about it. So Hu Jintao was sitting next to Xi Jinping and next to Li Jianshu, and they wouldn't let him see the list. And so you may remember the television footage from that period in which Li Jianshu tried to take it back from him. He said, "Oh, you don't need to read that." And Hu Jintao was sort of looking confused and saying, what's going on here? And eventually Xi Jinping called in his personal bodyguard, and they escorted Hu Jintao out of the meeting room at great embarrassment to himself. And everybody they walked right past Wang Yang and Li Keqiang and Hu Chunhua, and they were sitting there looking like somebody had hit them with an axe on the top of their heads. They had no idea what was going on until they found out the fact that they had been effectively removed from the inner circle of power. So Xi Jinping brought this whole situation on himself by changing the rules, by bringing in a bunch of thugs that had very little, and I'm going to be called on the carpet for this, I'm sure. But the fact of the matter is that something is amiss, and people in the party know it, and they have been critical of him to the point that his position is in some kind of jeopardy. Now, he may very well recover, and he may very well be able to fend off these attacks if attacks they were, or they may very well reject these stories as being fabrications. I'm sure they will do that. And many people will have to believe that. I don't know what to believe, but I do think that the system that was operating in Hu Yaobang's time, which was a system of power not being practiced by the people who were responsible for implementing it, is still with us. The relations among the members of the ruling elite are hostile and combative. They don't like each other. They don't cooperate with each other, and it's a constant struggle for power, which is what everybody who studies a Marxist-Leninist or Leninist system will aver. That's how they work. So that's where we are. I can't tell you how this is going to end. Xi Jinping may very well recover power. Wang Yang may or may not become the next General Secretary. Hu Chunhua, I think, is a not good bet to become premier because he simply hasn't been around. But there's a lot of discontent within that party, and it's beginning to leak out at the edges, and we need to follow it with whatever detail we can. As a former intelligence analyst, I ran across a lot of reports that were not believable. And I tried to discard them, and I occasionally got in trouble for it. But you have to balance what you hear against what you know. And the Communist Party of China does not want you to know much. And so knowledge is power. Propaganda is in charge, and the military is there to enforce the rules. So that's how the Yaobang story, and Yaobang is still revered in China. And that's why the Youth League is still, an authoritative organization. And that's why there are more who's out on the scene that might become influential in the future. So thanks for listening. I appreciate it. Questions are welcome.